Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is our June 5th session of the RARE Advocacy Exchange. Hopefully you've been with us for part of the series before now, but if this is your first one, great. And I think we'll move right ahead because we have a lot to cover in this great session. So, as I mentioned, this is part of a series, and you'll see on this calendar, we're now at the second half of the series, the June 5th, and for the next event in the series, we did have a date change. So that is now September 15th. If you were already registered, it would automatically change that for you. You'll get an email about that soon, probably tomorrow. And this is the June 5th session on interacting with the FDA, PFDD sessions and listening sessions with the FDA. We've got a great panel. Our own Charlene Rigby, CEO of Global Genes, but also someone who's participated in this process on behalf of her daughter's rare disease, STXBP1, and Larry Bauer, Robyn Bent from the exact department you need at the FDA, and Dorothea Lantz, who also, as her role in Prader-Willi syndrome, has participated in one of these, this process of these sessions. Of course, we couldn't do any of this without our sponsors. We're very grateful to all of them. Thank you. They make all this possible. And it's worth noting there are a number of ways you can participate beyond just listening today. First of all, we do record these sessions. So if your privacy is a concern, you might want to turn your camera off or on according to your preferences. There will be a poll maybe about 20 minutes into this discussion. And after the panel discussion, there will be a Q&A opportunity. You can submit your questions through the Q&A function in your toolbar of Zoom. Then, after those Q&A sessions, we'll go to breakout rooms, and there is one per speaker on this panel, and you can choose which one. Of course, we want you to share about this on social. If you use our hashtags, that'd be fantastic. And now I can pass things on to Charlene.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. As Daniel mentioned, I am the CEO of Global Genes, and I am a parent to a child with a rare neurodevelopmental disorder called STXBP1. And I'm really excited about the content of today's panel. When we are focused on developing therapies, engaging in the regulatory process in an effective way is really critical. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on one aspect, and a very important aspect of that process called patient-focused drug development. I feel fortunate coming from the STXBP1 community because we had our externally led patient-focused drug development meeting in October of 2023. And it was really a critical milestone in the journey that we have had toward developing therapies for our community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what our learning objectives are today, and I just want to highlight that this is one of the ways, that you can and should be engaging with the FDA. We had a session called the 7 Ways to Engage the FDA about a year ago, and I think we'll include that in the materials post-session. So in terms of today, our objectives are to understand the purpose of the FDA's patient-focused drug development program and the potential benefit of this type of interaction for patient advocacy groups. We'll learn about strategy and also timing considerations for these PFDD interactions, and then also importantly gain knowledge on how to prepare for PFDDs, including preparing the community and the attendees, as well as what the agenda and the meeting topics are going to be. So I'll introduce my panelists. Larry Bauer, who is Senior Regulatory Drug Expert at Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. Robyn Bent, who is the Director of the Patient-Focused Drug Development Program at CDER at the FDA. And Dorothea Lantz, who is the Director of Community Engagement at the Prader-Willi Syndrome Association. So we are going to start this session giving each of our speakers a few minutes to share a bit about their expertise in this area and their experience. And so I am going to start things off with Robyn. Robyn, so can you share with us a bit about the current state of the PFDD program and PFDD meetings? And I believe you may have some slides.
I do have slides. In fact, I have too many slides. So I apologize in advance for the fact that I'm going to go through them relatively quickly so that we do have plenty of time for questions and answers, and obviously for the other really critical information that my colleagues who are also on the line have. And so thanks so much for having me here today. It's really a pleasure to be able to come and talk to you about our PFDD program. I did actually want to start out by maybe talking a little bit more broadly about patient-focused drug development. Next slide, please. And so just as a definition, patient-focused drug development is a systematic approach to help ensure that patients' experiences, perspectives, needs, and priorities are captured and meaningfully incorporated into drug development and evaluation. Next slide, please. And so here, I just wanted to provide a little context. I forgot that I put an animation in. Would you click once more, please? I'm sorry. A little more context about where I work. I work in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And so that is one of the 3 medical product centers here at the FDA. And that's important only because there's a lot of work going on across all of the medical product centers related to patient-focused efforts. And so if I leave something out or don't discuss it because it's not something that's happening just in my small area, it's not meant to detract from the great value that it has. It's really just that I'm speaking about the things maybe I know more about than the things that all of my colleagues are doing as well. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that I did really want to just start out with talking about was that the role of FDA, because there are times where people can be confused. One of FDA's missions is to protect and promote public health by evaluating the safety and effectiveness of new drugs. So FDA does not develop drugs, and we don't necessarily conduct trials. We do play a role in trying to guide, advise, monitor, and evaluate things during multiple stages in the drug development life cycles. And so a lot of decisions related to drug development are made by people developing the potential treatment and not just by FDA. And so because of this, I think it's important to think about PFDD, patient-focused drug development, not just as an FDA effort, but as a broader effort that really encompasses the entirety of the medical product development kind of life cycle. And so before I narrowed down to talking just about PFDD meetings, I wanted to touch on just a few of our other PFDD efforts, and just note that these are a bit of a subset of some of the efforts, because there are many at FDA that have patients at their core. Next slide, please. And so here, when PFDD first began in 2012, it was with this goal of holding about 24 condition-specific meetings to hear directly from patients about their lived experiences. And the goal of this was really to help provide what we would call a therapeutic context, what it was like for patients who are living with a condition, so that could inform our benefit risk assessments. But we quickly learned that we needed to kind of move beyond just these meetings, because hearing about what matters to patients at the time of review means that it may not have been incorporated into drug development throughout. And so, for example, we started to work on a series of methodologic guidance documents to really discuss how patient experience data could be included kind of in a stepwise manner throughout the development process. We developed a grant program to support the development of core sets of clinical outcome assessments in areas where our reviewers had identified a need. We're holding public meetings to discuss methodologic challenges that developers are facing in using patient-focused approaches. We're working on international guidelines on patient preference studies. We continue to look at how FDA and others are using patient experience data to better understand some of the opportunities as well as some of the challenges. And we're developing and conducting internal and external outreach and training just to kind of make this a more standardized process. And so, as I mentioned, these are just a few examples because while we're here today to talk about the PFDD meetings, they really are just a part of the much larger effort that is patient-focused drug development. But now let me just move on to the next slide and we can talk a little bit about the PFDD meetings. And so here, externally led patient-focused drug development meetings, we really recommend that they're held very similar to those original FDA-led PFDD meetings. And FDA still does continue to do PFDD meetings, just the externally led have certainly outnumbered the ones that we're able to hold just ourselves at FDA. And they really do have these very discrete kind of portions of the meeting where we start out with kind of an overview, we move to the hearing directly from patients and their loved ones about symptoms and daily impact, then move to the current treatment options, and then there's a meeting report developed that we then post on the FDA PFDD page. And we do this all, we want these meetings to really be held in kind of that town hall discussion format where the patients and the caregivers are really doing the talking, and the FDA, the medical product developers, the researchers are there really doing the listening to understand. Next slide, please. And so when somebody is interested in hosting a PFDD meeting, an EL-PFDD meeting, we really have a timeline that we recommend that is about 12 months, just to allow the submission of the letter of intent, the getting all of the details together. We'll review the letter of intent on a quarterly schedule. We'll bring back any questions. We'll work with our review divisions to get any recommendations for questions or topics. And then you'll all work together to do the planning of the meeting, developing your meeting materials, conducting the outreach. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about all of the different aspects that happen in a PFDD meeting. And then the meeting is held. And then we do have that post-meeting kind of follow-up and discussion around the voice of the patient report. Next slide, please. And here I just wanted to show you several resources that we've recently placed on our website, including the condition-specific meeting reports. And this is a page where all of the meeting reports from both the EL-PFDD meetings, FDA-led PFDD meetings, and patient listening session summaries are available to researchers. So they have one spot that they can go and find this information. I know it's used by a lot of our reviewers as well as a lot of medical product developers. Next page, please. And then here we have a list of the upcoming externally led PFDD meetings. This is relatively new. I will place that URL in the chat. Yes, when I'm done talking, I will do that. But it's relatively new, and this is just one-stop shopping so that people can see what is coming up instead of having to go to every different patient group's page to identify where the meetings are. And I know I'm out of time. I just want to hit my last slide, which is really just a comparing and contrasting of PFDD meetings and patient listening sessions. And the difference really is that PFDD meetings are longer in duration, so they cover a breadth of topics. They really are public, and so you have a lot more people able to participate, and they're recorded, and the meeting reports are available. The patient listening sessions are smaller. They're certainly less resource intensive. They're a little bit shorter. They last 1 to 1.5 hours. They're non-public. You're just talking to FDA instead of talking to medical product developers and everyone else. They have about 8 participants, patient or caregiver representatives, but they also generate a summary. And so I think we're going to have a bit of a discussion later on about some of this. So I'm not going to belabor the point, but that's kind of just a little bit of a difference. And I was assuming these slides would be shared. Is that correct, Charlene?
Yes, they will be.
Okay, perfect. Very good. So the slides will also be shared. So, and with that next slide, please. So I am done with my presentation. So thank you very much. And I look forward to questions, although I suspect that my colleagues will probably cover many of the things that I didn't.
Thank you so much, Robyn. And And thanks also for sharing those resources kind of through your presentation. As Robyn had commented, we will share the slide decks and the recording after. The one of the things that I also have learned from this process is that because the resources, the Voice of Patient report gets posted to the FDA's website, it really does become this touch point resource that is both used from a regulatory standpoint as well as for drug developers with longevity, because it's living on the FDA website. And so I have to confess that I was very excited the very day that our report got posted in a few months after our PFDD. So. Um, well, before we get to our next speaker, Larry, I wanted to pull up a polling question for the audience. And so, oh, here it is already. So hopefully y'all are seeing that on your screen. So the question is where is your patient community in relation to communicating with the FDA through the PFDD program? And you can see that there's everything from I'm in learning mode to we're planning to we've already done a PFDD, and the poll question answers are coming in. So you can see that a lot of people are in learning mode, so that's excellent. About a little over half are just learning, and we do have about 8% who have already done a PFDD. So those perspectives will be valuable, especially as we get to the Q&A and the breakout. All of those perspectives. Great. Wonderful. Okay, that's wonderful. A lot of people, so really over 80% are in learning mode or planning, and then you can see that there are a number of folks who have completed either a PFDD or a externally led PFDD or a listening session, very pertinent to the last slide that Robyn had. All right. Well, I'll bring up our next speaker, Larry. And Larry, oh, great. So, Larry, you worked at the FDA prior to being at Hyman Phelps, and so would love to hear about the history of patient engagement and how it's evolved over the years.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Charlene. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name's Larry Bauer. I'm currently working at Hyman Phelps and McNamara, but in my previous life, I worked at the FDA, where I was one of the co-founders of the Rare Diseases Program and the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So I was actually working at the FDA in 2012 when the patient-focused drug development program really got off the ground. And in my role as being part of the rare disease program, I was, for several of the meetings that the FDA held, I was on the FDA panel, as a representative for the rare disease community and the rare disease reviewers at the FDA. So Robyn talked a lot about the current state of things. As Charlene asked me to do, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. How did we get here? Where is this all coming from? Next slide. I have nothing relevant to disclose. Next slide. So it was actually over 10 years ago that the FDA really endorsed engaging with patient stakeholders. When they talked initially in 2012 about the PFDD initiative, they said patients who live with the disease really have a direct stake in the outcome of the FDA's decisions, and they are in a unique position to contribute to the understanding of their disease. And just to clarify, as I speak, and we're talking about patient stakeholders, that includes both people living with the disease or condition, as well as their families and other direct caregivers that are helping them, and advocacy organizations that represent them. Next slide. So just a little bit about what did it look like at the FDA, before the patient-focused drug development movement started. So, there were a few ways that patients' voices were included in the process, but it wasn't didn't have the scope that it currently does. And some of this came from and emerged from in the 1980s when the United States and the rest of the world experienced the AIDS epidemic. So, it was the 1980s. There was this new communicable disease, and young men were dying in huge numbers. And these weren't old men. These were men in their 20s and 30s. And it was an incredibly disturbing, stressful time for the United States and the rest of the world. And people living with the condition, there were AIDS activists trying to bring attention to this. They wanted treatments, interventions to do something to try to help it. And they actually staged some demonstrations right on the FDA's doorstep. You can see here that some of the signs, they had things, people laid on the ground as if they were dead, had died from AIDS because of the slowness of the, any kind of drug development or approval process. Some of the signs were time isn't the only thing the FDA is killing, it's killing us. And if I die of AIDS, forget to bury me, just drop my body off on the steps of the FDA. So it was a radical time. People insisted on being part of the process, and the FDA was actually open to this. And they did start to include people from the AIDS activist community to meet with them and engage with them around this whole process. And this was the really earliest part of patient engagement. Next slide. So some of the principles that emerged related to patient-focused drug development, they were based in the 80s on HIV, but also, the experience with cancer patients also wanting to be involved. And some of the guiding principles are that patients and caregivers are really the people that understand their disease. They are the ones that are uniquely able to describe the symptoms that they have and the impact of those symptoms on their lives. And also, when you're thinking about developing a new clinical trial or study, patients and caregivers really are the ones that understand the risks that they're willing to take or to not take when considering a new treatment. And we cannot make assumptions about what kind of level of risk people will take unless we speak with them about it. And also, the final principle is that patients really want to participate in the development of products that they eventually will be taking to help them with their condition. Next slide. So some of this is overlapping with Robyn, but I think it's okay to hear it twice. FDA's role is to review medical products on a case-by-case basis when they receive an application from a company. So after all the research and clinical trials complete, all that data is submitted to the FDA for them to review it. Patient stakeholders, they can contribute to FDA's regulatory decision-making in several different ways. So they can, sometimes they advise on a very specific application. So that could be in the patient representative program, or maybe if there's an advisory committee for the new, as they're reviewing the drug, there's a section of it called an open public hearing, and there's an open mic section where patients and caregivers can present their ideas. And then there's the second group is providing context that's applicable to all applications. So these are the PFDD meetings that Robyn described, the patient listening sessions that she mentioned, and there's a third one way called critical path innovation meetings. These are more technical topics that aren't related to a specific drug, but are more overarching for drug development in a certain area. There's also opportunities to provide input on the subject of patient engagement. So this includes the Patient Engagement Collaborative, as well as the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee at the FDA. Next slide. So one of the culminations of this attention towards, bringing the patient voice into drug development was part of the 21st Century Cures Act that was signed into law in December of 2016. This new legislation, it required the FDA and companies to make make public a brief statement regarding how patient experience data and related information were submitted and reviewed as part of a new drug application or biologics license application. So this means that companies, when they submit to the FDA now, part of their submission has to be a description of how did we engage with the patient community. So some of the information included could be data that are collected to provide talking about the patient's experiences with the disease or condition, including related to the impact of the disease on their lives and patients' preferences with respect to treatment. It could talk about patient-focused drug development tools like patient-reported outcome measures and other information that FDA determines to be relevant. Next slide. So, in 2012, they wanted to make a more systematic way of getting this information. And as Robyn mentioned, the FDA developed the Patient-Focused Drug Development Initiative. This was a way to assess a drug's benefits and risks involving the analysis of the severity of the condition as well as the current state of the treatment armamentarium. So, FDA wanted to know how serious are the symptoms and life impacts of a certain condition, as well as what's available to them right now. Do they have a drug approved or no drug approved? What works? What doesn't work? And that helps to establish for the FDA what is the unmet medical need for this condition, which eventually influences maybe the amount of flexibility they'll have in the review of a new treatment. I think I mentioned this earlier, patients who live with the disease have a direct stake in this drug review process, and they're in a unique position to talk about drug development. And so once again, FDA wanted to have a systematic way that included many voices, not just 2 or 3 people with the condition, but a very representative sample of people living with the condition. Next slide. So the goal, like I said, was to hear from as many people as possible. The FDA, Robyn mentioned this, had about 24 meetings with stakeholders. That each one of those was focused on a different disease. The participants in those meetings were FDA review staff, the patient advocacy community, and other interested parties. FDA was in listening mode, wanting to listen and learn from people with the condition. And after each of the FDA meetings, they wrote a Voice of the Patient report, which was published and made public. And that Voice of the Patient report becomes a document that can be a reference for anyone working at the FDA reviewing a new treatment for a condition. Next slide. After doing that group of like 24 meetings, 24 plus meetings, the FDA said, wow, this really works. This is a great way to get information from patient communities, but we can't do this for every disease. There's over 7,000 rare diseases, and FDA said we cannot do all of our review work and do 7,000, all these meetings for, patient-focused drug development meetings for all these conditions. So they kind of passed the baton to patient advocacy organizations, and that's why they're called externally led PFDD meetings. It's external to the FDA. Robyn and her team are there to support advocacy groups that are planning meetings, but the meeting is actually held, developed, and executed by an advocacy organization. And as of June of this year, there have been well over 100 of these external meetings. Robyn mentioned this too. The first step is submitting a letter of intent to the FDA to propose the meeting. And then once the meeting's accepted, the FDA, helps from that point on. Most of these meetings have been virtual since COVID started, but it still is an option to have an in-person meeting. The one coming up for Shwachman-Diamond syndrome, or that just happened for Shwachman-Diamond, that was a hybrid meeting. So it was part of it was in person, part of it was, being broadcast. And once again, each of these, they ask that you develop a Voice of the Patient report, which then is linked on the FDA's website. Next slide. Just briefly too, Robyn had also mentioned patient listening sessions. These are ad hoc meetings with to help inform the FDA review staff about a disease and the treatment burden. They're shorter, they're 60 to 90 minutes in length. And it's a closed meeting. It's not, the PFDD meetings are public. These meetings are only between the advocacy group and staff at the FDA. It can be for a drug, a biologic, a device, or cross-center that involves, several of these. And the company I work for, Hyman Phelps, we can help you with plan these to send in a request for one and, to help develop the meeting. Next slide. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back to Charlene.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry. I'm now going to invite Dorothea to take the floor. So Dorothea, I'll prompt you by saying that the Prader-Willi community engaged in the PFDD program, and we'd love to hear about your community's experience with the PFDD,
Thank
the
you.
ELPFDD.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It really was an incredible experience, and I'm so grateful that you all have asked me and PWSA to come and share our experience with this group today. So thank you. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm not great at putting slides together and following them. So I'm just going to go ahead and say next slide. This is just a little bit of history about me, but I don't think that you all need to know anything other than if you look at that second picture on the bottom where there's this little boy who has beautiful blonde hair that's up in a bun. That is my son Hunter, who is now 7 years old, living with Prader-Willi syndrome. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay. At PWSA, we involve ourselves in all sorts of advocacy work, all the way from the Hill to the state level, to the local level. So this is just some photos of some of the work that we've done on the federal level and on the state level. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. What I really wanted to get to today was the meat of our ELPFDD. So we hosted in June of 2023, in conjunction with our national conference, which PWSA does every other year. So that being said, we're 2 weeks away, 2.5 weeks away from our next conference, which is insane. We hosted an ELPFDD. Now, a little bit of backstory here. We had already done a patient listening session, and we are one of the groups in the rare disease world that's extremely fortunate. There is a lot of research going on in the PWS space, so we're very, very lucky in that respect. That being said, during COVID, like I think many individuals in the rare community and ultra rare community, we had suffered, some significant setbacks. And so when I started at PWSA, it was about 4 years ago. We were in the middle of quite a few setbacks. As a result of the advocacy work that we were doing on the Hill and the advocacy work that we were doing on state level, we were able to engage with FDA and had an opportunity to work directly with Robyn's unit to put together this ELPFDD, which, before September of 2022, we didn't even realize that that was a resource that we had as a community to be able to look towards. If you look on your screen and you see a QR code, I try to use QR codes because I think that when we're doing PowerPoints, it's easier for people to just put their phone up against there than try to copy a link and paste it or put it in the chat, which I'm horrible at. So that is the link to our Voice of the Patient report. So for those of you, and I think the majority of this group is in the process of looking at what an ELPFDD might look like, that'll give you a direct link to our Voice of the Patient report so you can take a look at what we did. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This is a sample of what our agenda looked like. Now, as you've heard from Robyn and Larry, ELPFDDs can run the gamut. And when I was researching, what is this going to look like for our community, or what does this even look like in general? I spent about 2 weeks on FDA's website listening to as many ELPFDDs as they had available and registering for as many that were going to happen in the next several weeks. And I will tell you that as the mother of a son living with a rare disease and an advocate in our community, that was about 2 to 3 weeks where I was crying on a daily basis. All of us are living in a really difficult situation. All of us have mountains to climb. And I think that as we're going through a process of making sure that the FDA is informed of the unmet needs of our communities and the risks that we're willing to take to give our loved ones a better quality of life, I think it's really important that we engage with other rare and ultra rare communities and we listen to what they've done and we learn from each other. So it was close to a month of a really emotional journey for me as a parent as a caregiver, and as an advocate. So a lot of the rare disease communities will do a full day ELPFDD, an 8-hour. I listened to several who did 2 days. We had 9 months to plan this, and I say this jokingly, but not jokingly. We had 9 months to plan this, and I feel like our ELPFDD was the birth of my second child. If it wasn't for the way that FDA has set up the meeting schedules and the requirements, and that just kind of helping the rare disease communities go through the process of setting up an ELPFDD, we would have been lost. So they really did an incredible job of setting expectations and giving us enough time to plan. So we chose to do a hybrid, and I think Larry mentioned something that some communities do a hybrid. And I will just say that from our experience, you know, if you're looking at doing an ELPFDD, I think everything post-COVID needs to be thought of as a hybrid, especially if you have a community of people who may not be able to travel. You know, for us, there's the travel factor, there's the cost factor, there's so many different factors. We wanted to make sure that everybody in our community had a chance to participate. And we had opportunities for people who were online to also do questions and answers, suggestions and things like that. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Something else that we did was we had a graphic artist come to capture what it was that our folks were talking about. Our 4.5 hour, with the exception of our breaks, ELPFDD was comprised of an opening speaker who was an individual living with Prader-Willi syndrome. And then we had our first panel, which I believe in our first panel, we talked about risks and benefits and experiences. And then we had a break. And then in our second panel, the opening of our second panel, we had another individual with Prader-Willi syndrome speak. And then that panel was focused on people's experiences in multiple clinical trials that are going on in our space. Can you go to the next slide? I thought on my previous slide I had a couple of other QR codes, but it didn't go through the way I thought. We go back. Can you go back to the previous slide? Okay. So when we were doing the graphic design and we were doing these word clouds, we also had QR codes up on the screens so that people who maybe didn't have a chance to interact or engage could click on that QR code, and it took them to a template where they could share a story and they could write in their story. And there wasn't a I don't think there was a number of characters that it was limited to. And so what we wanted to make sure is that even when we were going to a question and answer session after a panel had finished, we wanted people to be able to share their stories so that we could include those stories in the voice of the patient report. And then we also did some polling questions where we asked people about risk benefits. We asked people about their experience with different symptoms of PWS and if they could rate it. You know, for our community, when people talk about Prader-Willi syndrome, they typically talk about hyperphagia, which is, you know, it is one of the hallmark symptoms of PWS, and it's the inability to ever feel full, but it's not the only symptom of PWS. And one of the ways that we were able to highlight that is by making sure that individuals living with Prader-Willi syndrome had the opportunity to share their stories. So when we went into our Q&A sessions after a panel would talk, we had individuals, especially individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome, being able to stand up and share what it was like for them to actually live with the disease. And that can be tricky, right? Because in the world of rare disease, you know, not everybody has the ability to speak. Not everybody has the ability to articulate what it's like to live with their disease. My son, for example, still does not have the ability to speak. He uses a talker, but still is very restricted in how he's able to share what his lived experience is. So one of the things that FDA came back to us after our FDA and we had our debrief after our ELP-FDD, and they said, this was the first time that we had an opportunity to hear directly from people living with Prader-Willi syndrome. So I think for those of you who are thinking about doing an ELP-FDD, if you have an opportunity to have individuals who are living with the rare or ultra rare disease share their experience, I would encourage you to do that. What that's turned into in our community has truly been amazing. And it's all a result of the work that we did at the ELP-FDD. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, there we go. Okay.
And
So-
I just wanted to kind of insert Dorothea. We're running a little long, and I do have a couple questions for you a little later that relate to some of the topics that you're.
Perfect. I'm sorry. I'll wrap it up.
Don't worry.
So all of this is to say that it was March 26th. We had our first approved treatment for hyperphagia and PWS, which for all of you who are here today, I'm sure that you can imagine what that feels like. This is the first approved treatment for hyperphagia. It is already changing lives in our community. We are extremely excited and have being in that top 5%, it's an amazing feeling, and it's a feeling of hope that has just been it has been just amazing for our community to be through. And I don't know that we would be where we are right now with this first approved treatment for hyperphagia and PWS if we hadn't gone through this process and worked with FDA to make sure that the voices of the individuals living with PWS have been heard. Next slide. And yeah, so with that, I'm going to close it out. If you guys want to scan this QR code, you can see some of the advocacy work that we're doing with PWSA. And that's it. So I am a little long-winded. I'll close it out, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dorothea. That's great. And now we're going to move to Q&A. And so I have some questions, and we've started to get some other questions in the chat, but please start, putting your own questions if you haven't done that yet. And anything that we're talking about now that prompts a question, please don't hesitate. So I'm going to start with Robyn. And so we often hear engage the FDA early.
Mm-hmm.
So, but at what point in the process does it make sense to engage with the FDA? At what point does the FDA want or need to hear from patient communities? What are the considerations that patient communities should be thinking of?
So I think that what's really, really key, and I know we're very focused on the FDA today, but I think that one thing that really needs to kind of come through, and I tried to touch on it during my presentation, is that it's not really just about the FDA, right? Like if there's not somebody out there who's working in drug development, like FDA doesn't have the ability to kind of force somebody to work in that space. And so I think, we do think that patient-focused drug development meetings are really most impactful when they're held early. And that's because you're getting kind of that information out there for both for FDA, obviously important, but also for medical product developers, for academic researchers, for others, to really kind of look at and hear what matters to patients, maybe identify new targets for therapies, maybe think about whether they need new endpoints. There's something that really matters to patients. We don't have a good way of measuring it. Maybe they need to start thinking about developing that endpoint. And if you're developing an endpoint, that takes a little bit of time. And so it's better to do that early rather than, when you're going into a phase 3 trial and you don't really want those delays. So we really do think that, like, when you have the ability to host a PFDD meeting, if that is something that you think is good for your community, and there are some instances where maybe a PFDD meeting is not the right approach, and I think we might talk about that a little bit later. But it's really, if this is and I think probably the people here on this call this doesn't apply to, but if your condition is really well characterized, if there's already a lot of activity and drug development and patients have already been really active and there's already a good understanding of what matters to patients through other resources, then maybe a PFDD meeting isn't the right route, and you want to have a scientific meeting where you bring all of the people kind of working into that scientific area, including FDA and others, together with the patients and others to kind of identify what the challenges are. But earlier I would say is better. Sorry, let me wrap that up. So thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think a good reminder that there are multiple ways to interact with with the FDA and really thinking about kind of the community's situation. And, so
Yes.
maybe I'll have a lead on that's a perfect lead on to the question that I wanted to pose to you, Larry. So going back to the patient-focused drug development program and the discussion around PFDDs, the public meetings versus the listening sessions. Can you talk about, are there some criteria that people can think about in terms of those specific interactions? And, are there certain situations when those wouldn't be the right approach?
Yeah, well, just kind of to add on a little bit to what Robyn said, patient engagement's an ongoing process. It's not like you just do it once and then it's done. It's once you start, it's ongoing, as you guys know that have been, doing this work. And as Dorothea said, they had both a patient listening session as well as a PFDD meeting. When I think about these things, I think both have really important input for the FDA. Like we said, that the patient listening session, it's a little bit easier lift. It's to prepare a 90-minute meeting, and it's just between the FDA. It's just a Zoom call with the FDA and the advocacy organization with about 6 or 7 speakers presenting. People living with the condition or family members. PFDD's a little bit of a heavier lift. They're longer meetings, but you do generate a voice of the patient report that's somewhat more comprehensive. And that voice of the patient report, when I worked at the FDA, there were reviewers that kept it on their desk, the voice of the patient reports, and used them as reference documents. So these are, it's an important resource for the FDA. And I think every organization kind of has to think about it, what are our resources? Where are we at? Do we have something in development? Is there, how close are we to maybe getting into a clinical trial? And let those kinds of things, help guide them in making a decision.
Charlene, can I piggyback off something that Larry just brought up about the voice of the patient report? Thank you. Folks, we're talking about, how this is helpful for the FDA, but how it's also helpful for outside entities. If you're looking to have, industry do research and development in your space, that voice of the patient report can be really critical when they're looking at, different endpoints. And evaluating, protocol and putting together clinical trial work. So it is for the FDA, but it's also for industry doing the research and development in your space.
Yeah, and that reminds me, Dorothy, too, that like if you have a listening session, you can also write that up as a white paper and get that into the public domain, to share any insights that you learned from that as well. So there's a lot of, you can be creative in this process. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Dorothea, just to amplify that, we in the STXBP1 community just met with a new therapy developer, and that they were going through our whole recording of our PFDD as well as our voice of patient report. And it really felt like, that really conveyed kind of the magnitude of the challenges of our patient community. It was really like very heartening to know that they had proactively done that. To inform their work. So I wanted to actually ask you, Dorothea, like you talked a lot about the agenda and that what a huge effort, and I totally appreciate that point around the preparation. Is there anything that you would have, like lessons learned, things that you might have done in a different way for the PFDD or for the preparation?
Absolutely. As far as preparation, I think one thing we would have done differently is more preparation for our panels. People tell you practice, 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 and then practice again. I think that maybe 4.5 hours wasn't enough time for us to drive home what we really wanted to drive home. We did what we could with the tools that we had. So I think we did the best job possible. But I would have liked to have done more practice. I would have liked to have offered our community a couple of opportunities prior to the ELPFDD to really set out and manage expectations. And we were very cautious because we have a lot of research going on in our space and we have a lot of drug trials. We wanted to be cognizant of the fact that that was happening. And, you know, there was a lot of almost walking on eggshells because we did not want to feel that we didn't want our community to feel that they were targeting or speaking about one particular drug or drug trial. And that was, you know, that was really tough for us. I'll just be honest and put it out there. It was really tough for us. So I think from our community perspective, I would have liked a little bit more preparation, but you know, hindsight.
Yeah, but I think that the point around community education is really important because it's I mean, you know, 4.5 hours or 6 hours, like it seems like a long time, but actually, if you want to make sure that the critical points that you want to get conveyed, you know, by the people who are going to be participating, it's really important, and also educating them on what the point of the meeting is. Well, so I wanted to go, Robyn, and ask you. So, from what I've seen of PFDDs, and I have to confess, Dorothea, I also went and binge watched a lot of PFDDs in preparation for ours, and it was an incredible experience. It's the FDA is quiet during those sessions, and so what's actually happening behind the scenes, and how does this become institutional knowledge?
Yeah, I think that's a really completely reasonable question to ask, because I think it is hard, especially in the virtual environment, to kind of know, are people watching, are people paying attention, are people listening, and are they hearing? And I will tell you that they are. And I know frequently I'll be watching something and I'll message one of my colleagues who's working in the space, or I'll be watching the PFDD meeting, and I'll be like, oh, okay, so that's what they meant by, like, we recently had a PFDD meeting where kind of in the morning they kind of started talking about behavioral challenges and behavioral challenges and behavioral challenges. And it took us a little while for us to get to the point where somebody actually kind of explicitly said like violent outburst or something like that. And it was like, oh, okay, now I understand what they meant by behavioral challenges. Like, and admittedly, I'm not in the review division, so I'm definitely not a subject matter expert on that condition. So and so the subject matter experts obviously have a better idea than I do. But it's just, you know, I'd like to know more. Do you think they can tell us more about X, Y, and Z? Because I think this was, you know, and so sometimes we'll either message one of the moderators or things if we're trying to get more information or things like that. But there's a lot of discussion between the reviewers and the review division. There's a lot of discussion with us, just to really kind of reacting to what we're hearing and such. And, you know, obviously I think you can probably tell from my opening slide and Larry's opening slide too, like we're nurses by training, right? And so we have some degree of understanding of things, but even in the conditions where I think I know a lot, I learn something new at an ELPFDD meeting every time, simply because the conversations that we have on a regular basis with our patients are very, very different than the conversations that patients and family members have with each other and have in these ELPFDD meetings, where it's just a kind of a deeper dive, and somebody will say something that they think it's like a one-off that their child does, only to have somebody else be like, oh, my child does that also. And they you know, so there's all of these connections made, and this kind of validating of your experience that you're not the only one who's living with this thing. And so it really is, you know, we're listening, but also it's really great to see others listening to each other.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move back to Larry. And so, Larry, you know, you left the FDA and now you're at Hyman Phelps. And one of the things that your firm does is work with advocacy groups to get ready for a PFDD. And in transparency, STXBP1 Foundation worked with y'all. And there was another group, I think Wilson disease, that I think is now preparing for a PFDD with y'all. So what are the reasons to get, you know, help from a, you know, consultant or consulting firm? Do PAGs need it? You know, what do they need to be ready for in the preparation process?
Yeah, thanks, Charlene. You know, I mean, some groups do it on their own. They put it together. I think depending upon your, what your staffing is, what your experience is. Some groups are, a group of moms that have come together and they don't have that much experience. So we've helped many groups with this. So we kind of know the steps that are involved. We really kind of give you a template all the way from the letter of intent. We helped, with drafting and reviewing the letter of intent all the way through the review of the voice of the patient report at the end. So I think it's an opportunity to work with, with a group of people that have done it before and that have experience. And some of us that work at HPM, we did work at the FDA. So I think we have a fairly good idea of some of the things that the FDA would be interested in, what's going to be on topic for the meeting, what's going to be off topic or kind of out of scope for the meeting. So, and we help as little or as much as needed. Different groups have different needs along the way. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I also wanted to mention that there was great support, from the FDA team as well in terms of, kind of support along the way and check-in meetings as well. So that's definitely a resource to leverage. I know we're running a little bit over on the questions, but I just wanted to, Dorothea, you started to talk a little bit about this, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the downstream impacts that the PFDD experience has created for your community.
It really opened up the floodgates for advocacy, and engaged for, I think, maybe the first time in our history of people living with Prader-Willi syndrome, individuals living with the disease, finding their voice and advocating for themselves. And our CEO, Stacey Ward, has worked in the PWS space for years and doesn't have a child with PWS, but worked in a group home situation. And our organization has worked really, really hard over the last decades to help adults living with PWS, find their voice. And to see for the first time, especially over the last couple of years, adults living with PWS, some of whom never had access to even growth hormone, which was approved for PWS in 2000, realize that their voice is the voice that needs to be heard, has been it's been one of the most impactful things that has happened for our community as a result of the ELPFDD. And we now have our adult advisory board, which is extremely active. With our upcoming conference, we've incorporated an adults with PWS conference where I think we have close to 60 adults living with the disease who are hosting their own conference within our conference. And it's the first time that individuals, this disease has been around for over 50 years, and it's the first time individuals living into their 50s feel like they have a voice. So that is, to me as a parent, that's been one of the most impactful things that I think we've seen. And I know that we now have an approved drug for hyperphagia, but I think really the most impactful thing that we've seen as parents has been our loved ones with PWS, realizing that they do have a voice and a say in their own future.
That's awesome. Well, now we're going to open things up to questions from the audience. And Mackenzie, do you want to give ask the first question?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm kind of combining a few here, but Jacqueline started us off with, how do we know when it is the right time to engage with the FDA? And is there sort of a step-by-step guidance playbook for those of us who are looking to start?
Robyn, do you want to take that one?
So sure. I think that, as we say, like earlier is better. I think it really depends on what it is that you feel like you want to convey to the FDA, understanding again that we're just kind of part of the larger process. And so I would say we have on the PFDD website, we have a list of how you can go about requesting an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. The 4 patients at FDA, 4 patients takes you to the Office of the Commissioner level website where you can look at information about patient listening sessions and learn more about patient listening sessions and things like that. So it's really just and you can talk to the people in the office of the commissioner of the patient, they're not patient affairs anymore, the public stakeholder group, and they can help advise you or help share some thoughts with you, because I think each situation is a little bit different. Each group's resources is a little bit different. What is known about different conditions, the amount of natural history data, all of these things are a little bit different depending on the condition. So I would just share the public stakeholder engagement as a really good resource. If you're thinking about a PFDD meeting, my staff at patient-focused@fda.hhs.gov would also be a good resource. But the websites are pretty robust, and we've tried to answer most of the frequently asked questions that we get on those.
Thank you. So there's a question on funding the cost of an EL-PFDD. And Dorothea, maybe you can talk a little bit about the considerations that y'all had in terms of how to cover the cost. I mean, obviously you also did it in combination with your family meeting. But if you can talk a little bit about considerations that you had in terms of being able to, support the economics.
Absolutely. So we knew that we were going to incorporate it into our family conference, which happens every other year. So, and we also knew it was going to be an added expense. So, I mean, to be honest, nothing was off the table for us. It was, who benefits from this? Or I guess in our world, it was who wouldn't benefit from this. So we went to families, we went to private sponsors, we went to industry sponsors, and we went to everybody. And we said, this is what we need to do. And we were able to raise money across the board to cover the expenses. It was a significant expense for us. We did choose to hire a moderator. We did choose to add some additional consulting as we were putting together the voice of the patient report. So the expenses were not insignificant. But we went to every single party who was normally involved in helping host our conferences and said, this is what we need to do, and will you help us? And everybody came to the table for us. So, it does need to be considered, and it is not an insignificant expense. But for us, it was, we didn't feel like it was a choice.
Yeah, and I've helped a lot of groups plan these, and I'm always the first one to say, to reach out to your industry sponsors, that they benefit from this meeting. First of all, usually there's recognition at the meeting. They get their logo and their name up there so that people see that they are supportive of patient engagement, and then they get to use, the voice of the patient reports in the public domain, and that becomes a tool that they can use. And I try to get groups to get 100% support from industry as often as possible.
Thank you. And one thing I want to highlight out of your comments, Dorothea, was around the voice of the patient report and how you had some help with that. We also had a medical writer help us with that because we, really wanted to have that level of rigor and making sure that the language the language tied, and that was extremely helpful because that touchstone, the importance of that touchstone document as an output.
Yes.
So there's a question also about, can the voice of the patient report be updated with new information or research that becomes available? And, so Larry, you had said that have been over 100 of these patient-focused drug development meetings. And Robyn, you talked about how the voice of patient report is on the website, and, then this document that can be referred to. Is it a static document? What's the typical protocol in terms of, because obviously, it will then last for a long time. So if groups need to update the information in it, what's the, right way to do that within the report or separately, et cetera?
So I think that it kind of depends on the circumstance. And if you were going to update the report, I would encourage you to come and talk to us. It's not, the report is really focused on what matters to patients and kind of like what they're looking for in treatments and things. So we would expect that even some changes in the landscape may not necessarily generate a completely different kind of set of priorities and things like that. I would also kind of go back to something Larry said during his presentation, which is this is just one method of communicating things. And in some ways, they're really great because we know that our reviewers know where to look for them. We know that a lot of medical product developers know where to look for them. But there's also a large community of researchers who really the first thing they do is literature reviews, right, when they're working in a space. And so getting things published, putting that out in the literature where people will be able to find it when they do a literature review. Our reviewers, whenever an application comes in, the first thing they do is a literature review to kind of look and see what is in the space, the current state of the science and things like that. So I think that I would discourage you from kind of just focusing only on the voice of the patient report, but also as the science evolves, as you're funding research, as you're doing qualitative work and trying to kind of do a deeper dive into maybe you heard something at a PFDD meeting and now you want to do a really like more robust look at kind of understanding that you consider also publishing these things in the literature so that they're available to even a wider range of people. So, but back to the original question, I would encourage you to talk to us if you felt like there was really something that was critically important that needed to do an addendum to a report or something like that.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you. Thank you. A question on community size. So do we need to have a certain number of individuals with a disease to engage the FDA? You know, just thinking about prevalence.
I can answer that. Yeah, the answer, yeah, it's no. There, you know, it can be the smallest, tiniest disease that's out there. And actually, sometimes those are the ones that need it because, you know, you have to remember the review staff. There's a lot of physicians working at the FDA that are doing the reviews of products. Things often, when we start talking about rare diseases, come across their desk. They probably, if they were working in a hospital or something, they might never have seen a person with that condition. That's how rare some of these rare diseases are. So yeah, the rarest and of the rare really need, you know, to have these kinds of meetings and so to help educate everybody about it. And oftentimes the rarer it is, the less that's really understood about the impacts of the disease. What really, you know, how does this really impact families? Because some of them are just newly discovered genetic diseases that, you know, we're just kind of pulling the community together for the first time, just starting to identify people that even have the condition. So I think it can be really relevant and important for those small communities.
Yeah, and things are moving so much more quickly, you know, now even versus a couple of years ago. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Question on nonverbal children. How do we tackle voice of the patient for nonverbal, you know, children or nonverbal patients, you know, in the context of, you know, these type of FDA engagements?
Can I chime in?
Yeah.
Okay, as the mother of a nonverbal child, this is a daily challenge for us, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to incorporate a graphic artist into our PFDD meeting and chose to put those graphics in the voice of the patient report. Because if you have people living with the disease who can't articulate it in words, maybe they can articulate it in pictures. So if you go to our voice of the patient report and you click through, as you go through the pages, you see the graphic representation of what it's like to live with Prader-Willi syndrome. And it was, I mean, I cry every time I look through it because this is my son who only for the first time last week used his talker to say, "I love you, Mom and Dad." And he'll be 8 next month. So I feel that, you know, if you have a loved one living with a rare or ultra rare disease who wants to participate, you know, if that's them drawing a picture, then that's their participation. If that's them using a talker to be able to communicate anything as to how they're feeling, then that's what it is. If that's putting together a puzzle of their feelings, then that's what it is. And you capture it however you can, and you incorporate that into the voice of the patient report.
Yeah, that's great, Dorothea. And I would also just say that for, there's situations also where patients are not necessarily able to participate directly in terms of sharing their experience, and their caregivers are really just so critical in the process to be a proxy. Obviously they're not directly experiencing, but due to their family circumstance are really the representative of the patient, and so that's so incredibly important. Absolutely. And it was very cool to hear during our PFDD that we not only had parents who participated, but really these extended families were, calling in to communicate what they were seeing and their experience, which was really valuable for informing the whole picture.
And folks, don't forget about siblings. Please don't forget about siblings. We have sibling groups, especially with PWS, where you're dealing with hyperphagia, the inability to ever feel full, and what does that do to someone's relationship with food in the house. And I think it's somewhere 80 to 90% of our siblings have eating disorders as a result of living in a house where someone has Prader-Willi syndrome. So it's a whole new can of worms. Don't discount what a sibling can bring to the table when it comes to an ELPFDD or any type of engagement or potential research in the space.
Thank you. So we have time for one or two more questions before we go to the breakout rooms. And so this is a specific question. What does the term biologic refer to when talking about the letter of interest? And maybe Robyn, you could take that one.
So I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not 100% sure, but I'm thinking that it probably is when we're asking you to kind of identify if there's specific groups that you have targeted, whether it's looking for somebody in the Center for Biologics, CDER, which is the Center for Biologics that looks at gene therapies and things like that, or whether it's somebody here in the Center for Drugs. It doesn't really. It's not critical because we talk to each other all the time. And so, and even if it's somebody that you don't identify, we will work internally. And if we send it to our CDER reviewers, they will say, oh, also CDER has something going on in this space. You may want to include CDER. We just had an ELPFDD meeting for PKU. And we ended up with CDER, CDRH, and the Center for Foods because there was a nutrition, a dietary component to this. And so we really do work closely together. So I'm thinking that it's just kind of, do you know that this is an area where there's something that would impact the Center for Biologics? So you want to make sure you ask for them. But again, even if that's not something that you particularly highlight, we're still going to talk to each other.
Thank you. So the last question is on, communities where there are Spanish-speaking or multilingual communities. How have PFDDs that y'all have been involved with addressed incorporating, the community members with different languages?
Yeah, I can talk about that. We had one rare disease where there was a significant community in Puerto Rico that was involved. So we had to have representatives from that community that worked with some of the speakers that were coming from there. And then there's ways technologically to do some closed caption work, on if it's a virtual meeting. And then we sometimes have translators in the background. So there's ways to work around it to make sure that everybody's voice, it does make it a little bit more complicated, but it is definitely possible to do that.
Yeah.
So.
Larry, is that the Hermansky Pudlak? Is that the meeting that you're thinking of?
Yes.
That was a really amazing meeting because they did such a great job. They even drove around, I think, to different areas in Puerto Rico where there may not have been as great of Wi-Fi reception, and picked people up and brought them to a conference center in in the center, just so that people would be able to participate. And they did that bilingual. We did a PFDD meeting on long COVID that was simultaneously translated in English and Spanish. And it was a bit of a lift, but it was certainly doable. Listening sessions, I think if you had access to an official translator, would be a little bit less complicated, because it's really it's just a smaller meeting, but it is absolutely possible, and people have done it successfully.
With ours, we did a translation via Zoom. So and I think it was we were able to translate to 33 different languages, if I'm not mistaken. And we had a sign language interpreter who was present on site.
Thank you.
One of the upsides of like the virtual meetings that we didn't have before COVID is that we now have such a broader reach that these meetings can have. It is really great to see.
Yeah, and some of the people's statements are pre-recorded. So if it's pre-recorded in another language, then you can add subtitles for the when it's presented at the meeting. So.
Oh, great point. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, we're now going to move to the breakout rooms, and so Daniel or Caitlin, are y'all going to do the magic?
Yes. Just a little bit of etiquette, try to, maybe the question you asked already didn't get answered and you want to use the breakout room for that, but we do hope that you'll try to stay to one brief question each, unless everyone else has already had a chance to ask their question. Again, these are the rooms you will choose. And just so you know, these resource links will be available in the slides. They're already in your chat. So please, everyone, start selecting your breakout rooms. Hi, everyone. Looks like we're all coming back from our breakout rooms. So just give folks a second to get back into this main room. Also, here's some key takeaways, and these were also pasted into the chat, but you may have taken notes. You may have your own takeaways. Reminder that the next session in this series is September 15th. That's a date change. If you already registered, you'll get an email to tell you of the date change. If you haven't registered yet, please do. The place where you register on our website is the same place you can find the recordings of past sessions, and today's session will get added in the next few days. Again, thank you to all these sponsors that make this possible. Couldn't do it without them. Thank you also, of course, to Robyn, Larry, Dorothea, and Charlene. Here is the survey. So we hope you'll take that. You point your camera at the QR code. It should launch that survey for you. And when you've done that, we send you the slides from today. So that will help us know if we should be doing more of this, less of this, something different, something similar. We appreciate all your input on that. Tell your friends about our sessions, invite them to the next one, or ask them to watch the replay if this one was of value to you and you think it will be to them. And just another view at what's ahead. 2 more in September and 1 more in October. So we hope to see you there, if not before then. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.